I think for beginning writers, one of the quickest ways to jump from that beginner stage to perhaps the more like journeyman intermediate stage of writing is learning how to implement scene and summary and being able to discern when a particular section of your writing requires one or the other. But what I've noticed with a lot of beginning writers is that at the very start of the writing process, people tend to focus a lot on one or the other. They write these very long sections that are all seen, where like every small action is said, and a lot of it could just be summarized, and you wouldn't lose anything. And then vice versa, you get the person who does a whole lot of section, a whole lot of kind of narrative voice, perhaps where they just dump a lot of information, but you don't actually experience it. You're not actually getting the full experience of seeing these certain moments played out. And when I'm talking about deciding and knowing whether to use a scene or a summary in your stories, what I'm talking about is just developing good judgment, just recognizing when you need to do one or the other, implement one or the other. I'm going to go a bit more into this in a moment, but the main way you're going to figure this out is by reading. Like it's one of those things where just reading a lot basically will teach you how it will give you basically an idea of how to use one or the other and give you different instances. Just because you're going to see how other authors use it and you're going to mimic it. It's not one of those things that you can really develop basically without seeing how other people have done it first. Unfortunately, it's just as much as you might try to, kind of best guess how to do it. The fact is, when you see an author that can really do it well, that can really mix scene and summary, beautifully, it's excellent. Like it's honestly one of those things, basically that like you'll see it basically in the story. Basically, a whole chapter will go by, and it's like magic. Like it's so scene and summary are interwoven so quickly and so well that you probably don't even consciously realize it's switching back and forth. It just plays out in your mind almost like a movie in a sense. And what one other disclaimer I want to give before going into this is I had a professor once tell me that being able to use scene summary well and kind of interweave it a lot, they made the argument that it can't really be taught. They can show it to somebody, but there are some writers that I guess need by to them just by inclination. They're going to basically know how to implement this much better than other people. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think maybe there are some people that are better at weaving both scene and summary, but I don't think it's one of those things that's just like some sort of personality or genetic thing where you just happen to be able to figure out just the right timing for it. I do think you can look at different works and can kind of mimic that and sort of pick that up. But I did want to put this disclaimer out there just because I have been told directly sort of a counterpoint to all this. So let's get into it. All right. So to start at the beginning, what is a scene? All right. So a scene is basically any kind of writing about a series of events that takes place in a particular place and time. As an example, if you're writing about some characters sitting in a dive bar talking on a Sunday afternoon, or if you're writing about your experience riding a motorcycle down a Grand Canyon on a cloudy morning, you are writing a scene. Here is a quick example of that. I'm going to recite the opening lines from William Faulkner's Barn Burning. It's a short story. This is the opening line. The store in which the justice of the peace court was sitting smelled of cheese. The boy, crouched on his nail keg at the back of the crowded room, knew he smelled the cheese, and more, from where he sat, he could see the ranks shelves close packed with the solid, squat, dynamic shapes of tin cans whose labels his stomach read, not from the lettering which meant nothing to his mind, but from the scarlet devils and the silver curve of fish. This, the cheese which he knew smelled, and the hermetic meat which his intestines believed he smelled coming in intermittent gusts, momentary and brief between the other constant one, the smell and sense just a little of fear because mostly of despair and grease, the old fierce pull of blood. Well, you can't get much more vivid than that, um, can you? But as you can see, that's an example of a scene right there, right? All of you feel all the senses, right? The moment happens in real time, and you are getting all of the senses, right? You're experiencing everything in great sensory detail. Now, in contrast, what summary is when your writing is untethered to a particular location or a point of time. For example, if you're writing about a character's tendency to fall in love in bars, or if you're writing about the state of bathrooms in national parks, you're writing out of scene. You're writing in a summary instead. An example of this is Richard Ford's Rock Springs, the opening to his short story. Edna and I had started down from Kalispell, heading into Tampa St. Pete, where I still had some friends from the old glory days who wouldn't turn me into the police. I had managed to scrape with the law in Kalispell over several bad checks, which is a prison crime in Montana. And I knew Edna was already looking at her cards and thinking about a move, since it wasn't the first time I'd been in law scrapes in my life. She herself had already had her troubles losing her kids and keeping her ex-husband Danny from breaking in her house and stealing her things while she was at work, which was really why I had moved in the first place. That and giving my little daughter Cheryl a better shake in things. As you can see, there's not one particular moment or place the author is using there, right? He's giving basically more of a quick backstory in a sense, just to get the reader up to speed with what's going on in his life. And so now I want to go over sort of when to use scene versus using summary. And the first technique and the first way to really decide is, as perhaps a general rule. Obviously, I read the Faulkner intro, which was in scene, but as a general rule, you can write out a summary before you start your scene, as a way to get some exposition out of the way and to show us a narrator's voice. Just using the example again from Richard Ford's Rock Springs, which I just read. That was the intro to give you all of the backstory, leading into it, right? It was one paragraph that kind of gives you the everything that's kind of led up to the present moment where the scene will come in. So what you do basically is you might want to use, a quick paragraph like that, basically a summary, and then jump into the scene and sort of pick up basically in media res or where things are in that moment. That would be the first way to use the technique of kind of weaving a summary and then bringing in the scene. Now, one important point I want to clarify. When I am talking about writing in summary, even though it's not a scene, you still need to be very detailed and very vivid. You can't just be vague and say it's a summary. Just an example, right? So I read the Ford example a moment ago. I'm going to reread that section if it was written vaguely instead, right? So here's what it might sound like. I'd gotten into trouble with the law in Montana, and so I decided to go to Florida where I had some friends whom I could trust. My girlfriend Edna had agreed to go with me because she wanted to get away from her ex-husband in Montana. He stole from her, which was one of the reasons we lived together. Another reason was that I thought it would be good for my daughter Cheryl to have Edna as a mother figure. This is obviously terrible, right? In comparison to what I just read a moment ago, this is a really bad scene. It's so vague, right? There's no specifics at all, right? When you are so vague, your writing comes across as very, very weak. And I mean, it just, I guess maybe I'll do another video on that another time. But in general, the more vague your writing is, the more weak it is. So don't ever, even when you're using summary, you don't want to use that as an excuse to be vague. You still need to be very, very specific with what you write. You're just giving yourself a chance to write out of time and place, so you're not constrained, by the immediate moment. So that was the first example, using summary as a way to introduce a scene. Now, I'm going to offer you the inverse now, which is writing a scene and then introducing the summary inside of it. So you can write exposition inside of a scene. You can write a summary if the actions in the scene naturally bring about something to a character's mind. Here's an example, right? I hit the brakes on the Volkswagen just as Julia, my ex-girlfriend, pointed out the wild turkey sitting in the middle of the road, and her parents, Steve and Madeline, who'd been suffering from mutually reinforced anxiety issues owing to the recent loss of their house fire in California, held each other and swore. As you can see, the first opening part of that line, right? I hit the brakes on the Volkswagen just as Julia, my ex-girlfriend, pointed out the wild turkey sitting in the middle of the road. And then we get to the next part of that, and we start getting into the summary, right? So, and her parents, Steve and Madeline, here comes the summary, who had been suffering from mutually reinforced anxiety issues owing to the recent loss of their house to a fire in California, held each other and swore, right? So we got all that parent backstory, right? The exposition, the parent backstory. And then it jumps back into the scene right at the very end where they held each other and swore, right? That's in scene. So what you're doing basically is you're mixing in the summary to offer a little bit of backstory, just as an example here, because by sort of the naturalness of the way our thoughts as human beings work is, things that happen in the moment can sometimes trigger, recollections, right? And so you're able to use the summary basically inside of the scene because that's sort of the way the human mind works there. So again, another example right there basically of when to use one or the other. You can kind of integrate them both in that way. And oftentimes when you see someone who's a really skilled writer, someone who's been writing for a while, that's often one of the ways you can tell, right? You'll read their work and you'll get this nice scene here and they'll mix in the exposition, they'll mix in the summary right along with that. Very, very beautifully. And you won't even realize basically there was such a transition. You'll just read the whole thing in one sentence there, you'll get the information, but you're not going to consciously switch in your mind between something that's a scene and a summary. You just know it's a very entertaining way to tell a story and you enjoy it. And now that I've just given that example, I want to caution you to not write exposition or summary in a scene when it wouldn't be likely that this idea would enter into the character's mind, okay? So I'll give you another example now of that. The renowned anthropologist Helen Jackson leaned back in her pink chair and stretched her toned arms over her head, worrying about the money she owed the IRS. Her adopted, lacrosse-loving daughter, Rita, walked up the front steps to their house, speaking on her cell phone to her kind-hearted, valedictorian boyfriend, Brian. As you can see, the two parts there don't go together, right? You have Helen Jackson, who's stretched out, in her chair, worried about the money she owes the IRS, and then in the very next sentence, we're given this whole backstory on her adopted, lacrosse-loving daughter, Rita, and her walking up the front steps of the house, speaking on her cell phone to her valedictorian boyfriend, right? Like, the two sections don't go together. You have someone worrying, and then all of a sudden, now we're talking about the other character's backstory here, right? It doesn't flow. If we were in Helen Jackson's head, she wouldn't be thinking of that. That wouldn't be the first thing in her head, because in this scene, he is worried about the money that he owes. So you want to be careful about using exposition, but when it realistically would occur to your character's mind, You don't just want to use basically, just summary and scene, weave it in between there, but not have any reason to actually have that occur. So it's a very, very important distinction to make. So the point I'm trying to get across with some of these cautionary things that I'm adding on is that whether you're writing a summary or a scene, you basically construct them in the same manner. You have the general constraints, right? The general constraints of just whether you're writing a scene or a summary, what it has to have, right? Like I mentioned, scene needs to be happening at a particular time and place. Summary is sort of out of time thought, right? So you have the general constraints, and then you have the specific constraints to the character or the storyteller, right? So it's first person. Again, you can't think of exposition basically that's not going to be realistic to them. In the same way that you can't write a scene and describe a smell if your character has a stuffed nose, right? Just if they can't smell it, you're not going to describe it. It's sort of the same thing with a summary, right? Like if the character is not realistically going to think that way, you can't show that in the exposition because you're sort of breaking the limits of what your character would think, right? You're breaking their constraint in a sense. So that is the main point I'm trying to get across is that you have obviously the general elements of just what you're choosing, whether it's scene or summary, and then you have to really factor in the storyteller and their sort of biases and their sort of restrictions, basically. So there is I guess my quick lesson on summary and scene, and I guess different ways to use it. Like I was saying though at the beginning of this thing, you're gonna get the most just by reading. The more you read, the more you're gonna figure it out. In fact, if I was gonna give someone like kind of like a lesson, develop this, a really easy lesson is just go online, or either write out or go online and copy and paste basically, a short story, and either physically highlight or on your computer take a highlighter and just highlight every single part that's a scene, highlight every single part that's a summary, and you'll notice basically the overlay, right? You'll see basically the different ways that it's been interbuilt into. If that's a word, interbuilt into. You'll see the different ways basically scenes and summary have been constructed together. If you're a very visual person, this is what I would recommend. Just because it's way easier to see this and then to sort of mimic it than it is to just like hear me talking about it. But that's what I'd suggest if you're looking to really kind of identify it and sort of, I guess, implement it a little bit better. But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where you're going to have to just look at what other people do and to get an idea basically of how to do it yourself. But I do hope this helps. And again, like I was saying, it might be, I do think there's a little bit of instinct to this as well, just some natural instinct perhaps to a writer. I'm just thinking more back now to what I mentioned about my professor earlier, where they sort of said that you can show somebody it, but you have to have sort of the instinct built into you. You can't really teach it. You have to sort of have the instinct to know when to implement one or the other. There might be some merit to that. Now that I'm just reflecting on that a bit more, there might really be a bit of merit in that. There might be some people that just naturally happen to figure out, okay, no one's gonna want to read this whole thing. I can get the same information across in a summary versus this is a scene that needs to be shown very vividly to get my point across, right? To get people basically immersed in my world. So take that for what you will, but I do think regardless of if that's true or not, you can make huge strides in your ability to do your scene summary just by reading works and just by highlighting and diagramming them out. But yeah, so that's it. I will be back obviously tomorrow. But any kind of questions on this, feel free to put them in the comments.